Good afternoon, everybody. It's Friday and the 26th of April. You're here at Lunch and Learn. As you know, today we have a guest speaker, Jack Ginsberg. He's spoken with us before here. Jack's just brilliant when it comes to HRV and biofeedback issues, and he's talked to us before, and you might have seen him at some conferences, but we were chatting that as we're both getting in the same age bracket here, we're starting to slow down and do less traveling and just do some remote stuff. So we're very happy to have Jack here today doing this webinar for us. He likes to have it where people will have access to asking questions as he goes. And for those of you that are using Oura rings, and that question came up a while back, I sent him the paperwork that I got or an email from Oura ring about HRV and how you read those measures to make how to understand them better. So he'll cover that stuff as well. So we're unmuting folks, but please keep yourself muted unless you have a question. And if you don't keep yourself muted and you make background noise, we will permanently mute you, and that will be the end of your ability to talk. So try to keep yourself muted unless you're asking questions. Jack, thanks so much for your time today and being with us. It's all yours.
Hello, everybody. First of all, let me get a quick feedback here. Everyone can hear me all right? I just need a signal, yes? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Richard Suter, my colleagues and friends in this field. We go back several years and have a lot of good memories, and I do appreciate the work that New Mind has done. When this began, Rob asked me specifically at the time, a little over a month ago, about Oura Ring and could I bring some information to this group, and I said, sure, I'd like, I'd be happy to do that and give a talk. So I made up, and he said, an HRV update and overview. So I made up this brief synopsis here, which you see doesn't mention Oura Ring at all, but it is in there. And in fact, my first slide is an attempt, let's see, page down. Oh, we're not changing slides here. Well, that's kind of a bummer. All right, well, that's it.
Here we go. Here it goes.
If I just click on the left click, it changed.
Yep.
So I'm going to open it up for Oura to begin with, and that way we'll have plenty of time. I did a little checking on it, and I'm going to cover this, but my point is that however much time or whatever questions are, let's do this now. Focus on this. I do have slides that pertain to the other topics. I'm going to try to go back. Yeah, I didn't do that. In other words, to what's in the synopsis, but at least we'll be sure and talk about Oura enough. Oh gosh, now, I want to go back.
Sometimes just using those arrow keys will work for you.
It clicked in, the first couple of times it didn't, and I guess it got warmed up. So now I can go this way and that way. All right, so we'll talk about these topics, which are a bit heady, but not until we talk about Oura. So I did look, not much more than the website. I've reviewed other devices and things like that. Oura and Whoop use RMSSD for short-term recordings and what they call readiness RMSSD for overnight recordings. Oura calculates readiness MSSD or RMSSD as the mean of all 5-minute samples measured while you sleep. Oura Ring samples at 256K, which is fast enough to be accurate. My 2 cents is that the information on the website has integrity, but I do not have experience with the device. But I read it fairly carefully, and I looked at some of the studies supporting it. There are only a few issues I might take with the website, but otherwise I would trust what is online. So instead of trying to present everything to you that's online, whatever you can get from online, except for these 2 exceptions here, I think is pretty good information, and you'll have to evaluate it and go on from there. But these 2 I did pull out. A normal HRV for adults can range anywhere from below 20 to over 200 milliseconds. And there's an asterisk on that. This HRV range is based on data. And again, this is from their website. So it's their text. that includes independent academic studies as well as Oura's proprietary data. Academic studies are typically restricted to smaller or less diverse populations and therefore may not be representative of the general population. It's that kind of thing which sort of increases my credibility. I mean, I think that's a good qualifier or a caveat, if you will, or disclaimer. Oura's goal in providing this broader range is to reflect the largest and most representative data set possible. Well, that's true, but which means you can't really use it very much unless you're in at least at the ends of the distribution. So it's including things which are not really normative in order to incorporate a minimum and a maximum of the range of what they call normal. And that's where I would quibble with them. While it may be more common for HRV averages to cluster around certain numbers, e.g. 50 milliseconds, there are individuals whose averages may not appear as frequently, but still represent a personal normal, e.g. 18 milliseconds. The most effective way to analyze HRV is to compare your values to your personal baseline. That is true. The utility of the type of wearables is in tracking your own, not really relying too much on the absolute value of any of these scores, which tend to be proprietary and have all sorts of things built in that as basic or clinical we wouldn't expect. So my comment was I would be suspicious that an RMSSD of 20 indicates poor health status, and they called it normal, but they also said, well, you know, it's the widest range possible. But that's where I would quibble with them. On the other hand, an RMSSD of plus 200 plus millisecond would most likely only belong to a highly trained elite athlete. So these ranges, it's true that from 20 to 200 is a range you might find for RMSSD across a very wide population, but they would vary in age, health status, and a number of different important characteristics. Even weight, height can affect these scores, these RMSSDs. Secondly, when comparing Oura's average nighttime RHR, resting HR, and HRV to a medical grade ECG device, the results showed a near perfect correlation for RHR and high squared correlation for HRV. Well, I can only say using an average nighttime defeats the purpose of having these accurate estimates of every 5 minutes, for example. And so I should certainly hope there would be a high correlation, because all you're really doing is counting pulses and just taking the mean of the number of pulses. And so at a minimum, the device has to be able to record the IBI accurately. And I think it does. I don't think there's any question that the Oura can measure IBI, as I understand it, at least without having experienced it, fairly accurately. But using the mean overnight is not a fair test of its accuracy of measuring HRV. All right, then, with that, I'm going to stop. And let's focus on Oura for a while. Rob, you may have to moderate this or however you want to handle it. But what would people like to know further or talk about more in regard to the Oura?
I think really the question was, the readings were getting relatively accurate, Jack, and we don't need to spend a lot more time on the Oura ring per se. People are just curious, because many of your people who were attending here want to hear just about any updates you know and information about doing basic HRV and not just an Oura ring. But that came up in one of our discussions because many of us use it. And what I would add that you may not know just simply because you don't have one is, sometimes if you sleep in a certain way and the ring isn't touching your finger properly, you get gaps in the data. And that just stops the recording. And like last night, I had some gaps in my HRV, but that was based on, it said awake time, and I wasn't awake. It was where I must have rolled over on my side or something, pushed the ring away from my finger, so it wasn't reading my pulse or anything. So I think this is good. I think what we can all understand is that, for example, my ring said last night my average HRV was 53, my max was 93. I'm within a good range, obviously. You can, the ring shows you charged. So unless anybody has a real specific question, I think we're good. Thank you so much for that.
Right. Well, 50,
I
50,
have a
that's good. Those are good
question.
goals, Rob. Way to go.
Okay.
I have a question. Do you have any comments or places to go to look at kind of a consumer reports comparison between the various smartwatches, or any thoughts on Fitbit versus all the others that are out there?
No, it's a very common question. A lot of people wonder about that, and I don't endorse one over the other, although I do believe there are very large differences in the reliability and validity. So as far as a single summary, here's the problem with that. There are so many new developments happening so rapidly. You would really have to have, and to be comprehensive and up to date would be a fairly large undertaking. And so often it's done by commercial themselves, by the companies themselves, and there are comparison charts. So I cannot say that I know of any objective, comprehensive, and current comparison of the wearables. It would be difficult because there is such a wide variety of qualities, sampling frequencies, storage, battery life, et cetera, et cetera. So no, you have to find out what works for you, do your research, do your due diligence, look for a minimum of 125K sampling. Don't go below 125K sampling. And that's not too difficult to do, but that will eliminate a lot of the sampling. And some of them will actually not even sample individual beats. They're taking 4 beats, getting an average of that, and kind of pretending like it was a single beat, and going on from there. That's very inaccurate. It's unreliable for HRV. So that's what you have to look for: sampling rate, and well, that'd probably be the single main thing: sampling rate and whatever works for you in terms of data storage and battery life.
And the next question was on the norms. I've read that older people have lower HRV and it's harder to get it up, among other things. And so I like your thought of starting with your baseline and your own personal baseline, and then seeing if you can improve that.
Yes, that is the way to do it. And I have to say, excuse me, I believe Oura gets high marks for doing an overnight. That's extremely valuable. And so without trying to get into what they're doing, this idea of taking sampling every 5 minutes and then producing a time series, I think that's good. If you don't have, if you're not missing data, if you don't have a lot of beats that need to be corrected. And so that's a problem. And unless you have a resting state and, good quality leads or good quality contact, you're going to have some missing data. That doesn't invalidate the whole trace. I mean, I do think that there's great value in a good wearable in helping individuals to get some insight into the variability of their own heart rate variability. But it's very difficult to say what an RMSSD, a legitimate RMSSD of 53 in one person may have a different interpretation and meaning in terms of health status for another person based on characteristics and a number of different things. So it is difficult to compare and to develop reliable norms. However, at the individual level and for a general rule of thumb, and you look at the norms, we say that about 50 milliseconds for an SDNN is a general indicator of health status, or a cutoff for health status. But it has to be qualified, sort of what the situations are. But 50 milliseconds is generally used as a cut point for health versus non-health status. HRV and prognostic, and so now we're sort of getting more, away from the specifics of RMSSD into these more general and current areas of development of HRV. Significance of HRV in prognostication, progression, and stage of chronic illnesses that have autonomic dysregulation in common. Well, this is really just a sort of a touch and run thing. I'm not covering it as deeply as you could, of course, but it's just to scratch the surface. And this particular study here, vagal nerve activity predicts overall survival in metastatic pancreatic cancer mediated by inflammation. And excuse me, a fairly large study. The final N was 272 after elimination, and it was an archival study. And they used SDNN and RMSSD. I am assuming that the expertise of the audience certainly would include time domain variables of HRV. But you can see the numbers there. And interestingly, 33, I think, is the, it's kind of blocked there. But, you know, it's sort of in that range. But these are not extremely healthy people to begin with. And of course, it is a metastatic pancreatic cancer. And they look at survival. And when they do the comparisons, in fact, survival is better when there is a higher, and they use a cutoff, which you'll see, that when there's a higher HRV at the time of diagnosis. HRV, the index of vagal nerve activity, was derived from a 10-second ECG near diagnosis. This represents efferent vagal nerve input to the heart. HRV is shown to be strongly correlated with and to be experimentally altered by vagal nerve activity. The time domain parameters, standard deviation of normal RR, SDNN in milliseconds, and root mean square of successive differences, RMSSD, between preceding RR intervals were derived. Such parameters from short ECGs have been found to correlate with ECGs of longer durations. And I've given you the citations that the original article gave with the same original numbering. Furthermore, 10-second SDNN measures have been shown to predict prognosis in cardiac disease and colon cancer. A cutoff of 20 milliseconds was used as past studies in cancer to distinguish between patients with high versus low HRV. Furthermore, 20 milliseconds has been shown to be the mean HRV in a big sample of cancer patients. So this is sort of that idea I was saying about where the cutoffs are, depends on the population and a number of other factors, but those are sort of a rough overview of what the numbers are. But what's really striking about this to me is that it's a 10-second ECG, just taking a very, very brief sample. The validity of ultra short, that is 10 seconds to 1 minute, cardiac interbeat interval recorded, being tested for predicting cancer survival and for estimating standard length recordings, overnight and longer. So what is that? Well, let's look at what a 10-second ECG, or what an ECG is, or sort of what the trace is. And then it's easy to think about it in terms of 10 seconds versus 5 minutes and so on. Well, so just going all the way back, heart rate variability is the pattern of changes in time, in milliseconds, between pulses. Excuse me. And when the heart is normal, operating normally, and there's good autonomic function and health status is good, it leads to a kind of a rhythm that we talk about, and it's all done by it's driven by respiration. And respiration at the higher rates is what we're used to, and respiration at lower rates, the slow deep breathing, has different and enhanced effects, but they work in sort of a similar manner. But the thing to remember is that heart rate increases on inhalation and decreases on exhalation. And if you take a long, deep, slow breath and then slowly exhale and feel your own pulse, you're going to feel that deceleration. It's very strong on the exhale. The deceleration of a heart on exhale is strikingly strong and you can feel it yourself just by exhaling slowly. So it develops this pattern that's in sync with respiration as the chest cavity expands and contracts for breathing. And it creates a pattern or a rhythm of acceleration and deceleration that is associated with that cycle. So while you're breathing in, inhaling, heart is accelerating. While you're breathing out, heart is decelerating. And that creates this sine-like shape of heart rate or IBI over time. And these are real data just to sort of give you a feel for how it looks, but you can definitely see there's a cycle in there from the IBIs. And then if we take a whole column of those numbers, we can generate the SDNN and the RMSSD. On the left, as you're looking at it, that column there, which is under the letter D, D means difference. So RMSSD comes from taking the standard deviation or the variance of the difference between successive beats. So in this case, in this column of numbers, the first difference would be 690 to 695, so that's 5. And you can see there how you get successive differences across IBIs, and that creates another data set, and that is the RMSSD, the root mean square of successive differences. And the SDNN is just the variance of the original IBIs. Any questions about that? All right, so now imagine that what we have is a column of successive beats, or in the original, of only 10 seconds. Typically 5 minutes, sometimes 1 minute, but the idea is to see if there's a clinical utility and in terms of convenience. And the application of this in terms of screening is enormous. If there is value in using a 10-second ECG to identify chronic illness, and this can be done on a public health basis of screening to identify people at risk or at various stages of different types of disorders, whether it's psychological stress, diabetes, or any one of a number of chronic illnesses. So if you have a 10-second trace of ECG, your data would have only approximately anywhere from 8 pulses to 14 pulses, depending on your heart rate, from which to calculate. Well, that's really amazing that there's so few scores that go into this relatively strong predictor of outcome. Now, there is this little situation here that the authors are aware of. It. Slower regulatory mechanisms contribute to HRV metrics recorded over longer measurement periods. 24 hours short-term and ultra-short are not interchangeable, meaning that the values are different. A 10-second ECG RMSSD would not be, even though there might be some validity in estimating what a 5-minute or a 30-minute RMSSD recording would be, not only is there a question of its validity or accuracy of predicting that, but how you're going to use that data, how it's going to play, so to speak. So the point is that you can't compare the score that you get from a 10-second ECG with a score that you get from a 30-minute. So the values are not interchangeable. But the understanding is that the relationships are the same, and that this 10-second ECG does have prognostic value for chronic illness. Would the longer traces have the same value? We would assume so. So if we look then at where we're at with respect to these short ECGs, the guidelines do recommend using 5-minute ECGs. Recent studies have shown that 10 seconds might be sufficient for deriving vagal-mediated HRV, in other words, indicating the parasympathetic deceleration component of respiration. So this study assessed the applicability of using 5-second ECG traces to calculate RMSSD risk prediction in epidemiological studies. Evaluated vagal-mediated HRV with ultra-short, based on 10-second multi-channel ECG recordings. And there were a large number in this study which just collected data on large groups of people. They divided the group into healthy and health-impaired subgroups, associated ultra-short HRV with HRV derived from longer-term ECG recordings and polysomnography, and orthostatic testing, 5 minutes of rest before probing a reaction. The validity with respect to demographic variables. And this is all testing the utility of the 10-second ECG. Significant correlations were revealed between ultra short and regular HRV. Controlling for covariates, ultra short HRV was the strongest predictor for longer term HRV. And associations of ultra short with age, sex, obesity, and depression were similar. So they conclude in this very recent study provides evidence that ultra short HRV derived from 10-second ECG might function as a proxy of vagal mediated HRV with similar characteristics. Allows the investigation of ANS dysregulation with ECGs. Okay, enough reading to you. You get the point, I'm sure. So what are we talking about here? Not just pancreatic cancer, but autonomic dysfunction plays a role in virtually all of the global burden disease states, whether it's ischemic heart disease, stroke, cancer, COPD, and so on. So there are many commonalities at the autonomic level of these population level, global level chronic disorders driven by smoking, bad lifestyle, and so on. Anybody to fight them? Is there one factor which predicts the lower risk, is related to fewer risk factors, inhibits biological causes of global burden of disease? Well, yes, that would be the vagus nerve. The proposed resilience factor is, and these slides are provided to me courtesy of my colleague Yori Gidron at Haifa University in Israel, who's done numerous wonderful studies in the area of vagally mediated chronic illness staging and prediction. So the vagal nerve hypothesis for global public health. All right, changing in, excuse me, into our last. First of all, are there any questions there? We're probably going to have plenty of time here. I had about 25 slides. I'm hoping for robust discussion. So before going on to a very interesting and emerging area of what can be called fractional directional fractionation of autonomic nervous system, before taking on that last bit of the synopsis, are there any questions? No? Okay. All right then. HRV and adaptation. Ethnic and gender differences in HRV blood pressure profile. Now what that means is the relationship between heart rate variability and blood pressure, thought to be attributable to difference in sociocultural and physical challenges. So what we're saying is that the association typically at the most general level, the lower HRV goes with a higher blood pressure. That's kind of the way it manages to keep homeostasis. And there's an inversion there, and it can happen on a very short time scale, including respiration, and also over longer time periods. There are other cycles of heart rate variability and blood pressure that are important for homeostasis. And what's being found is that this relationship of HRV to blood pressure does differ in certain populations that seem to be those that are particularly faced with sociocultural and physical challenges. In other words, it's suggesting that there is an adaptive alteration of normal homeostatic, or at least what we think of textbook medically as a normal relationship in autonomic nervous system between HRV and blood pressure. And in particular, as you'll see, there's one aspect of blood pressure, peripheral resistance, which appears to be a mechanism by which the normal relationship, the inverted relationship of HRV and blood pressure is changed. And so that both HRV and blood pressure are elevated. And that's what this is all about. Leading the way in these series of studies, and I didn't make a bibliography for you. I thought I might, but it'd be very easy. If you just go and Google Scholar or PubMed, whatever, if you do Thayer, that would be Julian Thayer. If you do Thayer, ethnic HRV difference, you will get quite a number, let's say a half a dozen, maybe more, articles specifically dealing with this, what he calls the cardiovascular conundrum. The cardiovascular conundrum. And this is one example of a paper in that series, Ethnic Differences in Resting Heart Rate Variability, Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. So from the abstract there, I think it's important to look at some of the details here because it really, the details are important in understanding this, I think. Ethnic disparities in cardiovascular morbidity and mortality are widely documented in the literature. Recently, research has shown that decreased parasympathetic cardiac modulation is associated with the established and emerging risk factors for cardiovascular disease and stroke. In consideration of the disproportionate CVD risk and disease profile of African Americans, it is plausible that decreased cardiac PNS functioning, i.e. higher heart rate, may partially explain these disparities in cardiovascular disease risk, i.e. In the present systematic review and meta-analysis, we assess the available evidence for a reliable ethnic difference in tonic, that is long-term, vaguely mediated heart rate variability, an indicator of PNS. Well, you can believe that they're strict in the method here, and the conclusions then, after managing the covariates, including health status, medication, fairly large scale analysis here, suggest that decreased vaguely mediated HRV is not likely to account for persistent health disparities with respect to cardiovascular. Underscore the need for continued research. Well, that is a moderation because if you look specifically at the results, meta-analysis suggests African Americans have greater HRV than European Americans, even after consideration of several covariates. And so I think here, what he's done is sort of set up a bias against himself and couldn't demonstrate it. So, well, look, if we're going to find higher blood pressure, which is well known, we should also find lower HRV in populations with higher blood pressure due to sociocultural or institutional stresses. But in fact, it wasn't that way. And it's this peripheral resistance where there appears to be a departure from the normal relationship or the less stressed relationship, the basic relationship of HRV and blood pressure. So these two studies here, more or less, I think, summarize a relatively large literature. Paradoxical profile of greater elevated sympathetic vasoconstriction, increased total peripheral resistance, and increased vaguely mediated HRV exists. And he calls this the cardiovascular conundrum. It's reported in African Americans at rest and response to orthostasis. And they show the same effect in another, what they define as another population that is likely to be exposed to episodes of discrimination, and that is lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And in fact, they do find a higher TPR as compared to matched controls. Well, that's pretty important to be aware of. I think its interpretation is still being formed. Results are discussed in terms of maladapted physiological consequences of exposure to chronic stress and the chronic use of dysfunctional emotion regulation strategies, such as suppression. And so here in conclusion now, what's new is old. And so this reminded me of studies by the great John and Beatrice Lacey. It all comes from Lacey, really, in an important way. Studies of heart rate and other bodily processes in sensory motor behavior in Obrist, Black, Brenner, and DiCara from 1974. And then, the Laceys are responsible for development of sort of the whole idea that we can actually calculate these differences very accurately in the IBIs, and from that generate really reliable HRV values from which we can then infer many different behavioral and physiological adaptations. And I think they led the way. Heart rate and blood pressure may increase or decrease, or indeed exhibit no change in response to stimulation or as concomitants of the performance of various tasks. These changes themselves may be correlated, but here, just to skip down, the direction of blood pressure and heart rate changes may reveal parasympathetic-like responses, while other simultaneously recorded responses reveal sympathetic-like responses, such as digital vasoconstriction. Whoa. To this phenomenon, we have applied the term directional fractionation. So in closing, Ham, we can discuss this further, but there is work going on currently involving Julian Thayer, involving some colleagues at Duke who are interested in differential surgical outcomes based on ethnic differences in baseline HRVs. So going forward, I think we're going to find that population level and even public health level in terms of the value of HRV, short traces, as well as at the population level, is going to lead us to be able to bring a higher level of well-being and health and wellness to the people we serve. And with that then, Rob, I think I'm going to say thank you very much. I love getting up in front of, it's not so much in front of people anymore, but being able to share what I know. And thank you all.
Great stuff. I have a quick question for you, Jack, and others may have more questions too. I was just chatting back and forth with Rusty Turner, who you may know, and we were so glad that you brought up some of the cultural differences. When you look at the medical literature, not just mental health, but medical literature, looking at, cardiac issues and other health conditions, there are beginning to see more and more research looking at cultural differences in all kinds of health and physiological issues. So I was really glad you brought that up, and now I'm beginning to think to myself, so should we pay more attention to this? If you're doing, let's say, assume, for example, that the African American race tends to have maybe a bit higher level of stress, then how does that translate when we're doing like a brain map and we start seeing, elevated stress levels in African Americans from a cultural standpoint? So it brings up a lot of interesting questions. It does.
It does. There's a couple of papers and sort of a move afoot that says that all HRV data now should be reported, broken out by ethnic, if there are ethnic differences in the sample, and gender, that there are enough differences that it's becoming imperative then that of course you're going to lose power if you don't do that. You're going to increase your power but decrease your sample size. But the idea is that combined norms are not, they're not helpful, they're not useful.
Sounds like you also have to add gender orientation.
Yes, age, anything. It makes it. I've heard Julian Thayer say that it's, and maybe he's a little over, but you can hardly generalize beyond a particular sample. And I mean, we'd like to think we can, but there may be going forward, the norms and the applicability of the norms and generalized norms. I'm not saying it's going to be impossible, but it's going to become increasingly important that the norms be more refined.
Jack, could you save me the mental torture of dumbing down directional fractionation to the 6th grade Reader's Digest large print level in about 4 or 5 sentences?
I will. Let's see.
Thank you.
Directional fractionation. Well, I'm going to use a metaphor, which I think would be appropriate.
Great.
Imagine a table that has 5, I want to call them pistons, or little things that can rise up from the table level, and they can go up or they can go down. And so it's like a little cylinder. It can go up and down. In most cases, the cylinders operate in association. So if cylinder 1 goes up, 3 goes down, but 4 goes up half as much. But there's a pattern of that. And those, we'll call them elements. Each one of those little cylinders is an element of a system. And they tend to aggregate or operate in unison and create a profile. But now we're finding out that if we take those 5 elements and look at certain situations, they don't operate with the same profile anymore. So this panel of what I'm calling here these cylinders, or this panel of elements, corresponds to different aspects of the autonomic nervous system. And so it could be peripheral resistance, it could be heart rate, it could be cardiac output. There are a number of different things in the cardiovascular system that all are elements of a single system. Sometimes it hangs together. It's not saying that the system doesn't work, it just works differently in some cases. That was more than 4 or 5 sentences, but how'd I do?
It's getting there. It's getting there. Now, I guess it's similar to EEG variables, that in some cases high alpha can mean something good, in other cases it can mean something bad. I'm curious about the whole role of suppression, since that's a nice psychodynamic term.
Yeah,
And I'm
right.
assuming
Yes, no,
that with trauma survivors and abused kids and all, it's going to be there in the clinical population that we see.
well, I do like that. And I'll tell you what little I know about it from that point of view of EEG. When I think about suppression of alpha by low or medium beta, I think the alpha is there. When you're in that kind of when you're in an alpha state, your beta is sort of hanging around, let's so to speak, or may even be present. But when the beta takes over, when you become stimulated, the alpha gets suppressed. It sort of goes away, but it's there. It's sort of underneath, so to speak, and then the beta is just not masking it, but it's over it, and then the alpha goes away. That's kind of the way I think about it. Is that, first of all, is that a fair assessment of what happens with alpha blocking? And what I'm trying to do is draw an analogy then between suppression in EEG terms and suppression as that may relate to physiological adaptations. And I can imagine, but this is just speculative, that a person in addition to having higher blood pressure, they may regulate their blood pressure predominantly by peripheral resistance. And if that's the case, then heart rate variability is going to have to work harder in an attempt to try to manage that homeostasis. In other words, heart rate variability would go up, but so would peripheral resistance in terms of the stress. I can imagine that state. It's not healthy. It sounds like a cardiovascular risk to have your heart is working hard. Parasympathetic is increasing your heart rate variability with your respiration, but at the same time, that peripheral resistance isn't cooperating with it. It's not in sync like we like to think when we get the big swells of amplitude. So if peripheral resistance is closed off, then heart rate variability, as it were, is working upstream, is trying to push up against it. And I think that's one, it sounds to me like a cardiovascular disease risk.
Got it. That's useful.
Thank you.
I think with the alpha and beta and alpha blocking on the more benign level, if you consider eyes closed, sitting, with your legs crossed, lotus position, and you're generating alpha, that's sort of a state of open awareness, or at least one meditative state of open awareness. And if you're trying to fill out your tax form, you're going to be in beta, more focused awareness. So it's not necessarily a chronic state, but a more switching issue. But then in chronic mental health problems, people are certainly more in a beta state of arousal.
Yes.
And can't relax.
Yes. And surely, the central nervous system is aware of both of the alpha, the EEG state and the physiological state. And so, a great search would be where is the mechanism linking physiological response to stress and stimulus, and let's say psychological stress and psychological stress related disorders, linking that to an EEG pattern, and sort of how those two, they must be an interplay, but the signals are so different that I don't know how to find a framework that puts together cortical EEG dynamically, real time. Now, I know there's studies, I'm aware of them, but I mean a single kind of overarching, brain mechanism, and it may be so variable, so highly, if not individualized, at least contextualized, that there's not a strong profile or pattern relating cortical EEG and physiological responses to stress.
Jack, thank you, and have a great weekend.
Been great. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everybody.